Imagine a royal guard with nearly 10 years of impeccable service, standing tall and immovable as tradition dictates. But one day, he finds himself hypnotized by the beauty of a tourist. Against every rule, he breaks protocol, not just with a glance or a word, but by engaging in conversation and interacting with her as if he were off duty. In that moment, he steps out of his role and into uncharted territory, setting off a chain of events that will change his life forever. Edward Havisham was used to being invisible. The impeccable uniform of the Royal Guard was like a second skin, his expressionless face his greatest shield. There, in front of Buckingham Palace, he was a decorative figure, part of a tradition that spanned centuries. The world revolved around him, tourists snapping selfies, children pulling faces, the distant shouts of impatient drivers. But he remained still until she appeared. At first, she was just another face in the crowd, but there was something about her that caught his attention. Maybe it was the way she looked at the palace, as if searching for something beyond the historical facade. Or maybe it was her smile. It wasn't one of those broad, exaggerated grins he saw all the time, but something subtler, something that felt genuine. She moved closer, a little hesitant. She wasn't trying to call him, at least not at first. She seemed to be taking everything in, the architecture, the tourists. Then finally, she looked at him. "I bet you're bored stiff standing there," she said, her voice light, laced with a musical accent he couldn't immediately place. Edward didn't respond. He couldn't. He was supposed to remain still, indifferent, as though she weren't there. But something in him cracked. She tilted her head, clearly intrigued by his lack of reaction. Her smile widened, and she stepped closer, like someone daring to break an invisible rule. "Come on, just a blink, a quick smile. I swear I won't tell anyone." It was absurd, of course. He couldn't. What was she thinking? But before he could regain his mental composure, she dropped her bag. By reflex, Edward stepped forward and bent down. The murmurs around them grew louder. Someone laughed. A woman with a phone whispered something in French. He ignored it all. He picked up the bag, stood, and handed it to her. "Here." Sophia, that was what she called herself, just after retrieving the bag and saying a soft "thank you" that sounded genuine. She stood there still, looking at him as though he was something more than a guard, as though he was human. "Do you have a name?" He wasn't supposed to answer. Every fiber of his being knew it. But in that moment, the protocols, the centuries of tradition, the speeches about duty and honor, it all seemed so small. "Edward. Edward. That's nice. It suits you." She smiled again, and he realized his breathing had quickened. She began talking about her trip, about how London felt like something out of a fairy tale. And instead of retreating to his post and pretending nothing had happened, he stayed. Every word she said felt like an invitation to linger a moment longer. He couldn't remember the last time someone spoke with such lightness, such life. She was everything he wasn't. And for reasons that defied logic, he didn't want her to leave. "Do you like what you do?" she asked with surprising bluntness. The question caught him off guard. He hesitated. "It's important." "Important and—" She paused. "Enough?" He didn't answer. He didn't know how. There was a silence that should have been uncomfortable, but it wasn't. She looked at him with curiosity, not judgment, and he realized that, for the first time in years, someone saw beyond the uniform. But then came the voice. "Havisham!" Major Sinclair was only a few meters away, striding toward him with firm steps and a face full of fury. Edward's heart raced. He had gone too far. Sophia noticed as well, but before she could say anything, he gave her one last look, as if trying to capture a moment that would last forever. "Edward, what are you?" He didn't hear the rest. Sinclair arrived, barking orders. The tourists were already recording everything, and Edward knew that in a matter of hours, he would be the most talked-about man in the royal guard. But as he was led back to the palace, under curious and disapproving gazes, only one thing was clear in his mind. For a moment he had been free, and he wanted more. If you're enjoying the story so far, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. We're about to switch narrators. I hope you won't miss this one too much, but let's be honest, you will, because I'm the best.
Edward felt the weight of silence in the narrow corridor leading to the meeting room. The gray walls, once familiar, now seemed oppressive. Each step echoed in the emptiness, heavy with the certainty that once he crossed that door, his life would change forever. Major Sinclair was waiting for him. The man was the embodiment of authority, rigid, meticulous, and utterly inflexible. He stood next to a polished wooden table, arms crossed, his eyes piercing Edward the moment he walked in. "Sit down, Haversham." Edward obeyed. There was no other choice. "Do you understand the gravity of what you've done?" Sinclair's voice was a contained thunder, each word carefully weighed. Edward took a deep breath but didn't respond immediately. Of course, he understood. He understood that centuries of tradition meant nothing if a man couldn't resist a single moment of weakness. "Yes, sir." "Then tell me, what was going through your head? What, in the name of His Majesty, made you abandon your post?" Edward hesitated. How could he explain something he barely understood himself? He wasn't impulsive. He wasn't the kind of person who broke rules. And yet, there he was, sitting in the meeting room, his career hanging by a thread, all because of a woman he barely knew. "It was a lapse in judgment, sir." Sinclair scoffed, unconvinced. "A lapse? No, a lapse is a misstep. What you did was a direct violation of protocol. And for what? To exchange words with some random tourist?" The words cut like a blade. Random tourist. Edward wanted to protest, to say she wasn't random, but how could he justify that? He didn't even really know who she was. "With all due respect, sir, I acted on impulse." Sinclair stepped closer, anger simmering beneath his controlled tone. "Impulse has no place in the Royal Guard. Do you understand what it means to wear this uniform? It means you're part of something greater than yourself. And now, you're the headline of every social media platform." Edward hadn't had the courage to check his phone since the incident, but he knew the Major was right. He could imagine the videos, the comments, the jokes. His failure wasn't just personal, it was public. "Do you know what this means?" Sinclair continued, leaning over the table. "You've jeopardized not only your reputation but ours, the institutions, and this will not be ignored." Edward kept his eyes fixed on the table. "I understand, sir. You are suspended, effective immediately." The words hung in the air like a final verdict. When Sinclair left the room, Edward remained seated. The silence enveloped him again, but this time it wasn't comforting. It was heavy, suffocating. A void grew inside him, an echo of the certainty that there was no going back. Later, outside the palace, Edward walked through the streets of London like a man marked. The sun was setting on the horizon, and the shadows grew longer as he passed unnoticed through the crowd. Despite everything, one thought refused to leave his mind: Sophia. He stopped in front of a shop window, his uniform's reflection now just a memory. He should hate her, maybe even blame her. But he couldn't. The idea that that moment, that brief connection, could have been a mistake felt wrong. Deep down, he knew he didn't regret it. Meanwhile, the city murmured around him. In cafes, on social media, on televisions and pubs, everyone was talking about the royal guard who had broken the rules for an unknown woman. The images were everywhere. Edward handing over the bag, the two of them talking, the look of surprise and admiration in Sophia's eyes. And her? She was seeing it all too. Sophia sat in her small hotel room, a laptop on her lap and her phone constantly vibrating. Messages from friends, social media notifications, invitations for interviews. "Did you see this? Is that you in the video? That guard was so handsome." She should have been excited, maybe even amused by the situation. But she wasn't. All she could think about was Edward's face as he was taken away. His seriousness, the weight of that moment. "I need to find him," she thought. And as London carried on with its routine, two paths that had crossed by chance began to align once more. Edward woke up early, as he always did, but for the first time in years, he had nowhere to go. The uniform, hanging in the wardrobe, seemed to mock him. The sense of purpose he had clung to for so long had evaporated in those few words of suspension. The world outside, however, wouldn't let him forget. Headlines screamed phrases like scandal and forbidden romance. Videos of the incident spread quickly, sparking heated debates. Some saw him as a romantic hero, others as a disgrace to the guard. He ignored it all. There was no room in his mind for public opinion. Only one thing mattered: Sophia. He couldn't stop thinking about her, the way she seemed to care, as if she had seen something in him that he didn't even know was there. But how could he find her? He didn't know where she was staying or how long she'd be in London. Edward sighed and went out for a walk. The icy morning air stung his face, but it was better than the suffocating confinement of the apartment. He chose less crowded streets, far from the tourists and the looming shadow of the palace. Meanwhile, in a cafe on the other side of the city, Sophia sat with a cup of tea that had long gone cold. Her phone lit up constantly, but she'd put it on silent. The messages were all the same, and the interview invitations were becoming more persistent. She refused to respond. She didn't want to turn this into a spectacle. "You can't avoid it forever, you know," said a woman sitting next to her, an American tourist she'd met at the hotel. Sophia shrugged. "I'm not avoiding it, I just don't want to overdo it." The woman laughed. "Overdo it? You're practically a modern Cinderella. People are obsessed with you and the palace guy." Sophia rolled her eyes. "That's not it. He's more than just a palace guy." The woman raised an eyebrow. "Oh, really? Then why are you sitting here stewing over this instead of going after him?" That question lingered in the air. Sophia knew the answer was simple: fear. Fear of rejection. Fear that the moment which had felt so special was just that, a moment. But at the same time, she knew she had to try. Sophia stood abruptly, leaving some money on the table. "I have to do something." The woman chuckled again, but Sophia was already at the door, moving with a determination she hadn't felt since the day before. Edward was sitting on a park bench, his face tilted toward the overcast sky, when he heard a familiar voice. "Edward?" He turned, and there she was. Sophia. She looked different, as though carrying a weight he couldn't quite identify. But there was still something vibrant about her, something that made the world around her feel more alive. "Sophia." A moment of silence hung between them, heavy with all the things left unsaid. Finally, she stepped closer, stopping just a few steps away. "I didn't know how to find you, but you've been on my mind the whole time." Edward smiled, a small but genuine smile. "I've been thinking about you too, more than I should." She laughed nervously. "I saw what happened, the news. I'm so sorry." He shook his head. "It wasn't your fault, it was my decision." "Do you regret it?" The question hung in the air, every word cutting like a blade. Edward knew the answer would define more than just that moment. "No," his voice was firm, without hesitation. "I don't regret it." Sophia looked relieved, but there was still something in her eyes, a mixture of doubt and emotion. "And now, what will you do?" Edward chuckled softly, without humor. "That's a good question. I don't know. Everything I thought I knew about my life changed in that instant." She took a step closer. "What if I told you that you don't need to know right now?" He looked at her, and for the first time in a long while he felt something close to hope. "Then I'd say you're right." Sophia smiled. "Come with me. Let's figure it out together." Edward hesitated for just a second, but only one. Then he stood up, and the two of them began walking side by side, with no clear destination, but with something that felt bigger than any plan or rule: the possibility of something new. And in that moment, that was enough. Edward sat in a stifling room at the Royal Guard barracks, a space heavy with the scent of old wood and authority, waiting for a meeting whose outcome he already knew. Major Sinclair was not the kind of man to forget infractions, and a breach of protocol like his would not be forgiven. The door opened abruptly, and Sinclair stormed in, clad in an impeccable uniform. He didn't even bother to sit. "Haversham, let's get straight to the point," he said, his voice like stone scraping against iron. "Your suspension will not be temporary. We've decided to expel you from the Royal Guard." Edward waited for a surge of emotion, anger, despair, regret, but all he felt was a strange calm. "I understand." Sinclair raised an eyebrow, clearly expecting something more dramatic. "That's it? I understand? You served the guard for nearly 10 years, Haversham, and now you're throwing it all away for a woman you met in 5 minutes? Edward slowly raised his eyes, unfazed. Sir, with all due respect. He paused, carefully choosing his words. If 5 minutes were enough to change the course of my life, perhaps the problem wasn't in those minutes. Perhaps it was in who I was before them. Sinclair pressed his lips together, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. You're a fool, Haversham. There's no honor in throwing away a future for the thrill of the moment. Edward smiled faintly. Honor is relative, sir, and I've spent too long living for the honor of others. The Major stared at him for a few seconds, as if waiting for Edward to plead for a second chance. But he wouldn't. There was nothing more to say. You're dismissed, Haversham, Sinclair said coldly. Go live your life of impulses. Edward stood, firm but with a relaxed posture, as if a weight he'd carried for far too long had finally been lifted. Thank you, sir. Sinclair didn't reply, simply watching him leave with an expression of disdain. Outside, the sky was gray and heavy, but Edward took a deep breath, the air feeling cleaner somehow. He wandered the streets of London aimlessly for a while, feeling almost light, until he stopped in front of a small bakery that smelled of freshly baked bread. A sign in the window read, Hiring. For a moment, he found himself wondering if it would be so absurd to work there. A simple job, with no rigid uniform or protocols to follow, no pressure to uphold unyielding traditions. Just a place to work, earn an honest wage, and live. He smiled to himself. That was what he wanted. A simple life, alongside someone extraordinary. He took out his phone and sent a message to Sophia. Edward, I'm free. The response came almost immediately. Where are you? At the bakery on the corner of Northumberland. Wanna come? She replied with a single word. Sophia, on my way. In less than 15 minutes she arrived, her hair loose in the wind, her cheeks flushed from the cold. When she saw Edward, she beamed, and for a moment he felt as if the entire world had stopped. So, she asked without preamble. Expelled, Edward said with a shrug, as though it were nothing. Sophia blinked, trying to process the information. And how are you? Good, actually. Great, he smiled, genuinely. I think I've never been better. She studied him for a few seconds, searching for the truth in his words, and found it. And now, Edward glanced at the bakery sign and chuckled softly. I think I'll go in and ask for the job. Work here, sell bread, and live a simple life. Sophia raised an eyebrow. Work in a bakery? Why not? You're trading the Royal Guard for bread? Edward laughed. No, Sophia, I traded the Royal Guard for you. She was speechless for a moment, but her eyes sparkled. Are you sure? Absolutely. She looked at him with an intensity that made everything feel more real. Then let's do this together, wherever it takes us. Edward stepped forward and took her hands in his. Together. And so, on a quiet street in London, without protocols, ceremonies, or the weight of expectations, Edward and Sophia took a step towards something that felt both terrifying and wonderful at the same time. The freedom to live their own lives. The sign at the bakery was just the beginning. Filled with optimism and the sense of having control over his life for the first time, Edward walked into the shop and asked to speak with the manager. There wasn't much mystery to it, he thought. Working with bread seemed simple, a poetic contrast to the rigid military life he had left behind. The manager, a stout man with a flour-stained apron, seemed skeptical from the start. Do you have experience working in bakeries? He asked, folding his arms. Not directly, but I'm a hard worker and I learn quickly. Right. And why do you want this job? Edward hesitated. How could he explain that he was searching for something simple, something human, that he wanted to be part of a world where people smiled at the one serving their coffee instead of expecting him to stand still like a statue? I need something different. Something honest. The manager looked at him for a moment, then shook his head. We're not hiring at the moment. Edward saw the sign on the door and thought about arguing, but something in the man's tone made him stop. He thanked him and walked out, feeling the first twinge of doubt about his decision. The weeks that followed were a constant test. Edward spent his days handing out resumes at shops, bars, hotels, anywhere that would accept candidates without specific experience. Are you sure you're ready for hospitality work? Asked a hotel manager, with a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Yes, I'm willing to start from scratch. I'm sorry, but we need someone with customer service experience. The answers were always the same. No experience, no chances. Sophia tried to help as much as she could. She used her free time between freelance jobs to search for job postings and encourage him. Something will come up. You just have to keep trying, she'd say, typing on her laptop, her face illuminated by the bluish light of the screen. But Edward was starting to wonder if that was true. The money was running out too. Edward had received a modest payout when he left the Guard, but it wasn't enough to support the two of them for long. Sophia didn't earn much either, surviving on temporary work as a freelance journalist. The rent for their small apartment on the outskirts of London felt suffocating, and their meals grew simpler. Instant soups, cheap sandwiches, anything that wouldn't strain their budget. One night, while they were in the cramped kitchen, Edward stared at a pot of instant noodles and sighed. "This is ridiculous. I can't even keep food on the table." Sophia stepped closer, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Hey, don't say that. We're in this together, remember?" "Yes, but you didn't give everything up. I made this choice." "We made this choice, Edward. You and me, together." He tried to smile, but the weight of failure was clear. For the first time, he began to wonder if he had made a colossal mistake. The tension started to build. One day, Sophia returned from a meeting with an editor, bringing good news. An article of hers was going to be published in a major magazine. "They're paying a decent amount," she said, trying to hide her excitement but clearly thrilled. Edward smiled, but it felt forced. "That's great." Sophia noticed. "What's wrong?" "Nothing. I'm happy for you." "Edward, don't lie." He set down the fork he was holding and rubbed his face with his hands. I should be the one responsible. I should be the one holding this together, not you." "Who says it has to be that way?" Sophia asked, her voice rising slightly. "I don't mind working. I don't mind holding things up until you find something. But I do." Edward snapped, louder than he intended. A heavy silence fell. Sophia crossed her arms, looking at him with a mix of frustration and empathy. "You know what I think? I think you're used to living by other people's expectations. First the Guard, now this idea that you need to be the hero of our story." Edward didn't respond. He knew she was right. Sophia sighed. "You told me you wanted freedom, but freedom doesn't mean having everything under control all the time." She stepped closer, her voice softening. "We'll figure this out, one day at a time. You don't have to carry this alone, Edward." He nodded, but the doubts remained, tightening in his chest. The night was cold in London, and Edward sat on the edge of the bed, staring into the void. The small apartment felt even smaller under the weight of his worries. The distant sound of passing cars wasn't enough to distract him from the constant echo of failures in his mind. Sophia walked through the door with her usual smile, but it vanished as soon as she saw Edward's face. He looked more defeated than ever. His shoulders slumped as if carrying the weight of the world. "Edward, are you okay?" He looked at her and for a moment thought about lying, but decided against it. There was no room for masks between them. "No," he replied simply. She approached slowly, sitting down next to him. "What happened?" He sighed, running his hands over his face as if trying to erase the lines of worry. "I don't know if I can do this, Sophia. I don't know if I'm good at anything else. Every place I go, every door I knock on, they all shut in my face." She placed a gentle hand on his arm but stayed silent, giving him the space to continue. "I don't regret it, leaving it all behind, not for a second, because in the end, it brought me to you." He looked at her, his eyes heavy with sincerity. "But at the same time, I'm scared of not being enough, scared you'll realize I have nothing to offer." Sophia's heart ached. His vulnerability was so raw, so honest, it almost hurt. She opened her mouth to speak, but he went on. "You're the best thing that's ever happened to me, Sophia. And even if I have nothing, even if I fail at everything from now on, I know I made the right choice." She smiled. A small smile, but full of tenderness. "Edward, do you know what I saw in you the day we met?" He frowned, confused. "What?" "Honesty. You weren't trying to impress anyone. You weren't pretending to be something you weren't. You just were you." Edward looked away, as if he didn't deserve her words. "And that means everything to me," she continued. "Because in my world, it's rare to find someone like that." There was something in her tone that caught his attention. Edward looked at her, his eyes searching her face for something he hadn't noticed before. "What do you mean by your world?" Sophia hesitated for a moment, then gave a small laugh, as if she were about to reveal something obvious. "Edward, I'm not exactly ordinary." He raised an eyebrow. "I never thought you were." She smiled, but this time there was something more behind it. "I never told you because I didn't want it to change what we have. I wanted you to know me for who I am, not for what I have." He tilted his head, intrigued. "And what do you have?" Sophia took a deep breath. "My family? We're very, let's say, well off. My father built an empire in Brazil. Companies, investments, I'm the heir to all of it." For a moment, Edward didn't know what to say. He looked at her, trying to process what he had just heard. "You're saying you're rich?" "Technically a billionaire," she corrected with a timid smile. He blinked, stunned. "So, all this time, she interrupted, taking his hand, "I've been waiting for someone to see me as a person. Someone who saw me as Sophia, not as a last name or a bank balance." Edward chuckled softly, still in disbelief. "So, all this struggle I've been going through. You don't have to go through it if you don't want to," she said firmly. "You don't have to prove anything to me, Edward. I don't want you to wear yourself down trying to be something you already are." He stayed silent for a moment, then looked at her, a shy smile growing on his face. "Does this mean that if I want to, I can give up this resume life and move to Brazil with you?" Sophia laughed, light and genuine. "It means you can, but only if you promise to wear shorts and flip-flops every now and then." "I'm not sure I can let go of long pants," he joked, but there was a spark in his eyes that hadn't been there in weeks. She cupped his face in her hands, her fingers brushing against his short beard. "Come with me. Let's live a life that's ours, the way we want." Edward pulled her into a hug, and as she rested her head against his chest, he felt a relief he had never experienced before. From that moment on, the idea of an uncertain future no longer seemed so frightening. Because now, he wasn't just fighting for a job or for acceptance, he was fighting for something bigger, for them. And for the first time, he knew the battle was already won.
If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to the channel. We need your support.
Better stories are yet to come.